Order, order. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to our session on the conduct of elections in Northern Ireland. Could you say who you are and what your role is? And we'll start with Sarah.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Ling. I'm the Deputy Chief Electoral Officer for Northern Ireland.
I'm David Marshall. I'm the Chief Electoral Officer for Northern Ireland.
I'm Cahir Hughes. I'm Head of the Electoral Commission in Northern Ireland.
I'm Vijay Rangarajan. I'm Chief Executive of the UK Electoral Commission.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming today. Could you briefly set out your responsibilities regarding the running of the elections in Northern Ireland and your organisation's relationship to the other? And if I start with Vijay.
Thank you. So, as the UK Electoral Commission, we're obviously responsible for all of the elections across and oversee all the elections across the UK, including devolved elections in Wales and Scotland. Obviously, elections are not devolved in Northern Ireland, so we work incredibly closely through Cahir and his team with David, with Sarah, in the running of the elections. We set up the performance standards across the whole UK. There's an interesting question about whether we should do more in Northern Ireland. We're also working very closely with all the various governments in the UK about improvements, and we may come on to some of the improvements we're looking for based on our learning from the general election and previous elections in the systems that come, not least given some of the threats and the challenges to our electoral system. Finally, we are in charge of the transparency for political finance. So we obviously collate the parties' returns, candidate returns, and publish those so people can see who is financing what. And we maintain that system and have made recommendations about improving that system as well.
Just to add, in terms of the relationship that we have with the Electoral Office for Northern Ireland, it's very close, very positive working relationship, constructive friends, I think we like to call it, challenging but respectful. And they're up to the parliamentary election, as with all elections, we work very closely ensuring that we're giving consistent advice to candidates and agents on how to participate in the election. And then post-election, working very closely with David and Sarah in terms of looking at where improvements can be made. They're obviously responsible for the delivery of the poll, which I'm sure David will go into. But then that gives us the opportunity to come to people like you and make the case for reform.
Okay. David.
As the Chief Electoral Officer, I'm responsible in law for actually the operational running of the elections. There's a holy trinity, if you like, in terms of elections in Northern Ireland. There's the Electoral Office, who essentially administer the elections. There's the Commission, who, if you like, referee and provide communications on the election space. And then ultimately there's the UK government, who set the laws and the rules around how elections should be run, and we administer into those rules. I could say a bit around how the election in 2024 was run, but it's a vast exercise in Northern Ireland. It's a one singular electoral office. It's not local authorities. There's a singular office covering the whole of Northern Ireland. So we have 6,000 staff to hire for the election day. We have 605 polling places. We have 1,409 polling stations. We have 1.4 million electors. All of that, and then at the election itself, we had 136 candidates. It's a huge exercise, and we can't do that without the support of the Commission, but also the Police Service for Northern Ireland, a whole host of other people, local authorities, and Malcolm maybe come on to that in questions. But yeah, we can't do that on our own in the Electoral Office. It's very much a group exercise.
Thank you, David. And Sarah?
So as Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, I support David in his role. My background is elections across the UK, so I came to the Electoral Office with experience of running elections in GB. And I think for me the crucial challenge for David and the team is the scale in Northern Ireland. It is just where in GB elections are run at council level, you're dealing with much smaller numbers, and the challenge is huge for Northern Ireland on the scale.
David, what are your main reflections on running of the recent general election in Northern Ireland then, and the experience of, as you've spoken about, how many voters, candidates and electoral staff?
Yeah, I was actually out of the country on the 22nd of May, would you believe? I had no forewarning, neither did the Electoral Office. I don't think very many people had, to be fair. So we quickly mobilised everybody to get ready for the 4th of July. And over the bank holiday, the 27th of May, we actually were getting everybody in position. Very quickly, we were able to get essentially all our polling stations. We had already worked through that, but we Because the 4th of July, Chair, is a summer holiday for the schools in Northern Ireland. Schools run from the 1st of July right through to the end of August as summer holidays. There were some teachers we had to sort of talk to and make sure they were comfortable with the election running at that point, because that would be fairly unique. But we were able to get the poll cards out fairly quickly with the help of the suppliers. One of the things that we did in Northern Ireland this time, we expected a lot more demand for postal votes and proxy votes given the summer holidays. So we changed the way we do that. Typically we would have run postal votes through 2 tranches. We realised that we would have been delivering postal votes essentially while people were on their way to the plane on their holidays. So we brought forward 10 tranches. And if you look at the Electoral Commission's report, so we distributed postal votes quite quickly as we could get them out. That meant that the return rate, or the turnout for postal votes in Northern Ireland, was over 90%, the highest in the United Kingdom. And we think that was driven by the fact that we did this not in 2 tranches but in 10. And we think there might be learning for other parts of the United Kingdom on that. We also brought forward a new system for this thing called the digital registration number, which is a unique policy. In Northern Ireland, you have to have your digital registration number. Well, the vast majority of people have to have it to get a postal or proxy vote. And we had a new online system that facilitated that. 50,000 people used the online system, which is fairly unique. As I said, we ran the nominations. Sarah managed that end in terms of 136 candidates, and we also work very closely with the police and Cahir and colleagues around giving information and advice to candidates around security and things like that. The hiring the staff, the 6,000 staff, is no easy task. My predecessor, Mr. Bradley, and others used to do that all manually. We now use a digital process. We couldn't do that manually with the time scale, so it's all done through text messaging and communications like that. We also set up the 3 count centres in Belfast, Magherafelt and Craigavon, and we work with the police and that, and the media and others. But conclusion, I want to say I can't do this on my own as the Chief Electoral Officer with the staff. We've got the support of the local authorities in Northern Ireland, the support of the Commission, the government, the police, and a whole host of others. And just to give you an example, a headmistress of a special school across from the polling station in Magherafelt, she made her car park available for us for the Magherafelt Count Centre. I could go on and on about support, but we can't do that on our own. The support we got is phenomenal.
Okay, and Cahir, what would your reflections be?
I would echo a lot of what David says there. In terms of what the report found, overall there were high levels of satisfaction with the voter registration and voter experience on polling day, which is quite consistent in Northern Ireland, which is great to see. I think it's fair to say resilience is an issue, not only in Northern Ireland and across the UK, and David has given some examples of that. I mean, it is the sheer scale of it in Northern Ireland can be quite overwhelming, particularly with parliamentary and such a short timetable to prepare for it. Highlights for Northern Ireland, I think, as David alluded to, the postal voting worked quite well in Northern Ireland. That wasn't the case in some parts of GB, and Vijay can touch on that. I think issues around the digital registration number, which we have highlighted in the past as a concern, were dealt with again by the Am I Registered to Vote look-up search that David introduced on the Electoral Office website, and I think there's certainly merit on trying to roll something similar out across the UK. There is issues about the accessibility. There's a duty on not just David but returning officers across the UK to make polling station accessible. A lot of excellent work's been done about that, but there's a lack of awareness. I'm not sure, I remember it was 2023 where there was an option where people could request hearing loops or go online and put a request, and nobody did. So clearly there's more work to be done around communications and increasing awareness of the support that is available for people that need it. I suppose the other thing I would flag from the election, I can touch on this now or come back to it later, is that the parliamentary election back in July showed the lack of transparency in the co-option system that's used to replace vacancies in the Northern Ireland Assembly and local council. I'm sure members will have questions on that as well, so happy to leave that for now.
Thank you. And Vijay.
I just had one other significant issue that we saw across the whole of the UK, which was the abuse and intimidation of political party candidates. And that was a real feature. We made that one of the main recommendations of our post-poll report, published late last year. We saw a significant increase in the abuse and intimidation in the election, and it looks like it's very similar levels in Northern Ireland as across the whole of the UK. Tremendous amount online, particularly directed at women and ethnic minorities, and a significant amount offline as well. And we saw issues with posters, with abuse, with people outside family homes, Obviously, Mr. Speaker here is convening a speakers' conference to look at the issues around that, and we're feeding in some of the thoughts, some very technical, like there's work on candidate addresses, but there's a lot to do, I think, with the police across the whole of the UK, and there's some really good learning from Northern Ireland as well, actually, that we'll be bringing into that. But that is probably the single most disturbing issue from the 2024 election. There were several sort of dogs that didn't bark. We didn't see a massive AI deepfake set of issues. That's not to be complacent. We think there are significant problems which could come and are coming, and I've recently been working with the Alan Turing Institute and many others about trying to get ahead of that curve and put some protections in place against a combination of deepfakes, mis and disinformation, and the increasing use of lowering the barriers to entry from AI. But we noted in our post-poll report that we didn't see anything that, in our view, invalidated any of the elections or any of the processes that were running them. And administratively, it did work pretty well across the UK. We have broad, high levels of satisfaction, high 80s, 90s, or voter satisfaction. As David said, postal voting in some areas of the UK definitely needs to improve, and that's partly due to the fact that it was continuously produced postal votes, whereas when the election was called in some areas of the UK, the second batch of postal votes went out very late, and that meant people were on holiday. That did not happen in Northern Ireland, so there's definitely some really good practice that we want to learn from that.
Thank you. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I suppose just on that last point first, we did have cause to raise some issues around people receiving an envelope with no postal ballot in it, but subsequently no ability to verify that with the Electoral Office, and that was your problem. So I suspect that there may be merit in having some thought as to if a ballot is issued, it can either be destroyed or you know that only one is returned from the elector. I don't know if you want to touch on that, but just when postal ballots are made, very frustrating for people phoning up saying, I've received my postal ballot, but there's nothing in it. There's no ballot paper.
Absolutely, and it is a challenge. There is a difference in law between GB and Northern Ireland on that. So in GB, you have a reissue postal vote process, so that if there are any issues with the postal vote, if the person hasn't received the pack, hasn't received part of the pack, you can reissue that. That legislation wasn't extended to Northern Ireland. So we are hamstrung by the law on that. What we do though is in the issuing of postal votes, we issue all in-house manually. We have layers and layers of kind of checks and audits to minimise the problem. And yes, we're aware of a certain number of people who did ring and complain about that. That number was small, although arguably, that number should be zero. And we will continue to work on the processes internally to make sure that happens. And then it would be for the UK government to decide whether they extended any reissue provision to Northern Ireland, obviously considering the impact of us then being able to reissue the postal votes in the time required.
One of the things so the numbers, Mr. Robinson, were about 20 people rang us. Now, it doesn't mean that there were others. We issued 25,500. So that's the sort of scale. There could have been others, but we looked at our systems, and they were as solid as we felt they could be. One of the things is that the postal vote pack has a number of different pieces of information in it. It has about, I think, 4 or 5 pieces of information. We're looking at the possibility of essentially creating a pack where the 4 or 5 pieces of information are actually joined together, so that they're one continuous piece, one continuous document, and you tear off the ballot paper off the end of that. And the idea would mean then that we think what has happened is some people didn't find their ballot paper because it was in amongst those 4 or 5 pieces of information, so that they just lost. It was lost in that, because especially for a general election when the number of candidates is quite small. So we're looking at all the alternative ways of doing it, which would help the voter and also help us as well.
That then takes us into your relationship with the Northern Ireland office and your ability to propose or push for, even is it your role to push for amendments to electoral law? Tell the committee, I suppose, how that looks, what the window of 2 years without elections, does that provide a space of time that you have proposals you're going to bring forward to seek legislative change as to how elections are run in Northern Ireland?
So, I mean, I'm not responsible for bringing forward new laws. It's up to the Northern Ireland Office and the UK Government to do that. I know the UK Government are working on a new legislation with regard to votes at 16, or at least the plan.
Not that you'd be responsible for bringing them forward, but nobody's going to bring them forward unless somebody's saying there's a problem that needs fixed. So what sort of engagement do you have? What's your relationship like with the Northern Ireland Office, where you're saying, here's a problem, like postal votes, for example, here's legislation in GB that could be usefully transferred to NI? Are you having those conversations?
We have regular conversations with the Northern Ireland Office around lots of different matters. A specific one would be around the canvass in Northern Ireland. Maybe you want to discuss that, but that's one area that we have put in writing that we have concerns over it, and we'd like a reform of the canvass, and I think the Commissioner on record as that as well. But I mean, there are a significant number of small changes that would be beneficial. But the reality is that the government have a host of other demands on their time in terms of legislative change. We're trying our best to put forward the things, small things like the postal vote issue, but there are other, obviously, bigger issues that the government are looking at as well.
So the legislative programme's their problem, right? And you can use this committee as your battering ram on issues. So start spelling them out. What are the sort of things that you would like to see over the next 2 years before you get to the next council and assembly election?
Well, the critical one in the medium term is the canvass needs reformed. Absolutely needs reformed. I would put that at the top of the list. We're currently sitting with around 85,000 people on the register who, come the end of 2027, will be removed from the register. That's the way the canvass in Northern Ireland is different to Great Britain, and the legislation requires those people, if they haven't responded to the 2021 canvass, to be removed, even though we believe they could and should be on the register, and they currently are. But that requires legislation every time, so it's a regular process. So there's pieces around that. There's obviously the conversation around postal votes, and around maybe a situation there where we could change the law there. I actually think the mitigation for that is this administrative change, where we make it all, if you like, a linear ballot paper, which it doesn't require legislative change. So we're looking at other changes that don't require legislation, because we recognise that getting legislation change is difficult.
And do you publish all your aspirations on legislative change, or do you just go to the NIO and tell them? So
there's private conversations between ourselves and the NIO. We don't publish our manifesto for change, but the Association of Electoral Administrations across the United Kingdom would have a list of changes that they would wish. One of them, for example, would be the legislation for elections across the United Kingdom is quite a number of different pieces of legislation. It goes back to the 1983 Representation of the People Act, and the AEA, and we would support that, would like a reform of the legislation so that it's simplified and it's easier for administrators across the UK.
I saw Mr. Hughes wanted to come in at least, but just one final question, David, for you. How many reports in the 2024 Westminster election did you get of people turning up to a polling station to find their vote had already been cast?
None.
None at all?
None to me.
Any issues about impersonation?
None to me. None to me.
What does that mean? Are you aware of reports having been made to others?
Not about impersonation.
Right. So you're aware of people turning up and complaining to parties? Complaining to police? Complaining to the Electoral Commission?
There are complaints made to the police. There's one or two complaints made to the police, not about impersonation, but about behaviours at polling stations and things like that.
And fraud?
No, nothing about fraud.
Nothing?
At this stage, nothing about fraud.
To you or to the police?
Nothing to me.
Are you aware of any to the police?
The police are looking into cases. I don't know how many, I don't know where, but they are looking into cases.
Mr. Hughes?
I was just going to pick up on the point that David may come back to postal voting. I mean, in terms of the NIO, we are the ones that would make that case, change in regular contact with NIO. In terms of reform postal voting, that's a long-standing recommendation of ours. It is in need of modernisation. It's a paper-based system. In GB, they've moved to an online voting system application process that doesn't exist in Northern Ireland. That creates numerous problems if electors fill in the form incorrectly because it's such a short timetable. And to give credit to David and Sarah, they did do as much as they can to support voters. We did find that applications were not having the digital registration number. That was down, But the problem is, because it's a paper-based form, people were still making mistakes on the form, whether that was putting the wrong date on it or not getting it properly attested. So we've certainly been making the case to the NIO for a long time that there is a need for modernisation. Electoral registration's online and the absent voting process isn't. So that they clash, if you like. Going back to the point on resilience, though, I think the reason that postal voting works so well in Northern Ireland compared to elsewhere in the UK is the fact that we have quite low numbers of postal vote applications. I think about 3%. Is that right? Which is compared to 20% in GB. And in Great Britain, it's postal voting on demand. So once the election's called, you get your postal ballot paper, whereas the Electoral Office have to deal with thousands of applications coming in a very short timetable. So it's not without its challenges, reform, because it will test the resilience of the system. Picking up on the point about canvas, that is essential. We cannot get into 2030 without reform. There is a real risk that hundreds of thousands of people will fall off the register between 2030 and 32. Regulations did come into the effect in the last week, which will carry forward electors up until the end of 2027, which means they'll be able to participate in the Assembly and the local government elections. We know that many of those voters that have this stay of execution, around 50% of them had voted at the Assembly and local government elections, so they are engaged, they are participating in the process, but it shows that canvas isn't working, and it is also hugely expensive for what you're doing. I think looking at our own assessments of the register, you're looking at around accuracy completeness of around 85%, and there's very little movement there. Focus would be much better spent, and resource much better spent targeting that 15% of people that are not registered, and using the wealth of data that's available to the Electoral Office to manage the register. And that's certainly, the NIO are very aware of our position on that need of reform, and urgent as well. It cannot wait till 28, 29, 2030.
Were Electoral Commission observers aware of anybody having turned up at a polling station to find their vote had been cast already? No. And just to check with Mr. Marshall, your answer, not to me, I assume you're speaking on behalf of the Electoral Office when you say not to me? And none of your polling captains or anything reported anybody coming up to find that they could not vote because their vote had already been cast?
Not to me. Not that we were aware of. There may well have been people who said on the day, but nothing in writing to me.
From either the elector or a station captain to report at the end of the day? Okay. Sorry, sir. Yeah.
No, I was just going to take up your very kind offer, Mr. Robinson, to help with some of the modernisation issues that we do face. There are some different systems between Northern Ireland and GB, some of them for good reason, but some we don't see the need. We've already touched on issues of the canvas, we've touched on issues of the absent voting online portal, but there are quite a few others where actually the probable forthcoming legislation may give us an opportunity to actually, as systems are modernised across the whole UK, to actually bring Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK into a much more single system, particularly the register. But for example, things like the power to set the perimeter of a polling station, or various issues on candidate addresses. There are a whole series of things which actually could be made in the harmonised and made the same across the UK, where we can't see a specific reason why they should be different.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Adam Georgie.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, welcome, nice to see you all. I've got a couple of questions, Chair, if you don't mind, before I go into the substantive one in relation to a couple of points that have been raised. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the work that all those who work on council elections do. It's an intense period of time, ending with a very long night. So for candidates and those counting, so I want to acknowledge the work that people do. How many full-time members of staff has the Commission got?
The Commission has the Electoral Office.
The Electoral Office. Yeah, office.
The Electoral Office.
Sorry.
So we have just less than 25 full-time equivalent staff.
And when you ask for people to work at the count centres, and there's 3 in Northern Ireland, how are those roles advertised, and how much are people paid?
So the 6,000 odd temporary staff that we use at polling stations and at count centres, there's about 4,000 in polling stations and about 2,000 at the count centre. They get various rates of pay. So the polling station staff, the more junior staff, would get paid for and this includes training, we get paid around about £300 say less than £300 for the full day, plus obviously the training, etc. as well. And that goes up. Obviously, the more senior get paid slightly more. For the people who work on the count, it would be less than that. Obviously, there's not a full 18-hour day or whatever it is, so it would be less than that. But they would get paid a couple of £100, something along those lines. From memory, the total pay bill for the whole of the temporary staff is just over £1 million.
In my view, you can't put a price on democracy, so that's helpful. On behaviour, and you touched on particularly the police looking at issues of fraud at potentially polling stations. And we've also touched, Chief Executive, on intimidation and abuse and experience of candidates. Can I just ask what the experience of polling station staff was like, and what you would have had back from them, and did they experience anything on the front line?
So, I mean, I want to reiterate that the instances of anything that we would see to be close to anything like fraud would be really quite small. I mean, in the past, historically in Northern Ireland, there was lots of concern or issues that led to an act in Parliament in the early 2000s. So we don't believe there's a significant issue or concern in and around those matters. There are clearly at any election there are people who want to, if you like, move the system towards suiting their advantage, but that's just part of the normal run-of-the-mill of elections. In terms of the issues that we found at polling stations, there are clearly campaigning in the vicinity of polling stations, some of which we can't easily manage because we're legally there's an environment of the polling station that we're allowed to control in terms of entrance and egress, but beyond that we can't control that, and there are some instances of that. Not in all polling stations, but there are some instances and there people can get exercised about that, and we tried our best to manage that. But frankly, the only way that's going to be addressed or fixed is again if there was a change in the law. I mean, there are other parts of the world who have essentially the day there's no campaigning allowed, and perhaps that's maybe something that the government might wish to look at. But that's not for me; that's for the government to look at. But so we have that is something that does agitate voters, and we did have one or two instances of people being concerned around that and around the campaigning in the vicinity of polling stations.
Okay, that's helpful.
Just to say, Adam, I personally had to remove people from a polling station in Clarawood 2 years ago, and I was the only person from a party there, and the electoral staff couldn't cope with how they were being overrun by people who were just in for vandalism and pure thuggery, and I removed them. And the police came 20 minutes later, so sometimes having political parties in and around polling stations to defend the process isn't necessarily a bad thing.
And I wouldn't mess with Big Gav, so probably the man in need. Two final questions. One, Mr. Hughes, you touched on 3% of people in Northern Ireland or eligible voters use the postal vote. Do you get 100% return on the postal vote?
Either would be better placed to answer that than
So it was about a 90% return rate on the postal votes, which would be higher than the return rate in Great Britain. Probably a combination of one, the fact in Northern Ireland to secure a postal vote you have to have a specific reason as opposed to it being on demand as you wish. And then the secondary point is that we got our postal votes out arguably substantially earlier than a lot of places in GB did, so people had more time to return them.
And just for clarity, in Northern Ireland you can't do the up to 3-year request for the postal vote. Each individual election requires a separate application that has to be...
So there's certain groups who can have a permanent postal vote. So for sort of disability, employment, education, those applications have to be supported in a set way. So, signed by a medical professional, signed by professors, that type of thing. We have a small number of them, so it's about 5,000 that we have hold on permanently with postal votes or absent votes, because they'll be split between postals and proxies, and then everybody else would need a specific reason for that election to...
The threshold on eligibility for those 5,000 people, who determines that? I'm just thinking, there was an article I read in the paper, I think it was today, maybe yesterday, that talked about Northern Ireland's population getting older, and age wasn't one of the criteria that you referred to in the context of the storm we saw recently. Age actually becomes quite an important thing, particularly if you live on your own, a widower, etc. So age isn't currently a qualifying factor. How can that be made one?
So it's set out in the legislation what evidence you need to provide. In some cases that will be evidence, documentary evidence. In others it's an attestation signed by a specific person with kind of the declaration that the person would find it difficult to get to the polling station and vote in person, but age wouldn't allow that. You would have potentially the ability, if you were housebound, found it difficult to get out because of mobility issues, that type of thing, you would possibly be able to get a medical attestation.
Just lastly, Chair, Chief Executive, you said that there were a number of lessons that GB and more generally the rest of us could look to and pick up from Northern Ireland. Can you just expand on what they are?
They come in several areas. I think one of them is just to pay tribute to the work that David and Sarah have done on the way that registration is done in Northern Ireland, the way they've done postal voting. In many cases, for example, in the rest of the UK, you can't check if you're on the electoral register. You have to send in another registration form. We think somewhere around half of the registrations that we received, that returning officers received just before the general election, were duplicate. That's a really significant waste of voters' time and returning officers' time. Whereas in Northern Ireland, as David said, you can check your DRN, you know if you're on the register. There's been some really good work in the past, and we've learnt a lot from PSNI on policing around polling stations, on the abuse and intimidation work. Again, we'll be bringing that and learning from Wales and Scotland and around the UK into the Speakers' Conference. So there's a number of areas where we think your systems in Northern Ireland are good and would like to build on all the best practice. Obviously, we've quite a dappled, complex picture now with electoral legislation, with different systems in Wales, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in the UK, potentially getting even more complex with local government reorganisations coming. So that running a number of different electoral systems themselves and election law underneath it, we will be looking closely at where is there a need for divergence and difference, and where does it make local sense, but where actually isn't there, and having a slightly more uniform system, particularly as some of our core systems, not voting itself, some of the core systems can be improved and made more accessible by being online. And I mean, the DRN and being able to check your registration is a great example.
I mean, that brings with the challenge of accessibility, of course, but you're right. United in our difference, I think, speaks to the story of our kingdom, doesn't it? So yes, that gives us food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Alpington.
Thank you very much for those answers already. I'm going to ask about the candidate experience, particularly around that point about harassment and abuse. So, Mr. Rangarajan, you've already said that Northern Ireland was broadly similar to the rest of the UK in terms of the experience of candidates. Could you just maybe give us, draw out that picture for us? What was that experience as you'd characterise it? And did it inflect in any way differently in Northern Ireland? Were there different issues? Was the abuse the same? Even if it was at the same level, was the nature of the abuse the same, or did that take on a slightly different inflection?
I'm sure Collins would want to add to this. Overall, the picture looks similar. And let me just point together the numbers, the data that we have on the 2022 Northern Ireland Assembly, the 23 Northern Ireland local elections, and then the general election. They were broadly a very similar picture. Somewhere around half of candidates, and we survey all candidates after, somewhere about half of them said that they had endured harassment, intimidation, or threats. They had a problem with it. 6%, and it varies about 6 to 10%, say they have a serious problem. Now, the kind of intimidation is things like having campaign assets like posters defaced, destroyed. There is a group who are then made to feel intentionally unsafe, and some of you may have experienced that. And then there's a very significant group who have endured tremendous abuse on social media, and sometimes that is spilling over. It's not an enormous problem yet with the kind of the most serious forms of that, but we've been doing a lot of work before this election and now with both PSNI and police forces across the UK to try to get the guidance right, both for the police to make sure that they can respond and they know the standards here, that they can apply that uniformly, and there's been an issue of uniform application, but also that candidates know what they have a right to expect. They know that this is not okay, and they can go to their police, to their SPOC, their single point of contact, we have Operation Bridger, and there's a lot of work now trying to to improve that. I think 2 points from us would be, one, it needs to apply for all candidates, not just members of Parliament, though members of Parliament obviously very are crucial for this. Second, we're concerned about the future because in our public polling, we see a really clear age trend in who thinks it's acceptable to abuse a politician. So if you ask people aged over 60, high 80s, 90s say it's not acceptable to abuse either a member of the public or a politician. Whereas the 25 to 34-year-old bracket, there's a very large difference. Still 80s, 90s say it's not okay to abuse a member of the public. Under half think it's unacceptable to abuse a politician. And there is a straight age gradient. We've published this, all the public polling we do is published and on our website. But that's the graph that concerns us most because it indicates the problem could get worse. Now, why? There's a possible link to social media. There may be a bit of it's okay to troll someone. I can post some things about someone. It's therefore okay to say it to them in the street. It may even be okay to say it to them in the street, in front of their family, in front of their family home, and then you're down a path that does not end well. But we do think that it's really important that some of these trends are picked up. And then the final one, I'd say, it's very directed, or at least it appears to be very directed. Women in particular have got some horrendously misogynistic, soft porn threats. There is clearly a group of people out there who are making fake videos and posting them. I think there's some very interesting evidence from Channel 4 and from various others who found some of these sites. So we need to put some defences up, in our view, in online as well as offline. We obviously work closely with the social media firms. And sometimes they will take some of this material down, but sometimes they won't, and sometimes it spreads very quickly. But there is clearly a lot of work which we are trying to do with our colleagues in Ofcom and with the police about how we can police that, they can police that. But maybe there is something also about collating together some of the abuse and intimidation that comes through on social media and looking at how we can track back to who is producing it. The Scottish Parliament have an interesting experiment running on that we think could be really valuable to generalise across the UK.
Thank you. Can I open up that same question to...
Yeah, I mean, the Northern Ireland experience is very similar to UK, and as Vijay touched on there, certainly since 2022, female candidates and elected representatives have reported horrific abuse, misogynistic, sexist, violent, and we've been working very closely with the PSNI to challenge that over the last number of years. It links in for the PSNI's strategy of tackling violence against women and young girls, so we've linked in with them very closely on that. The changes that have happened in recent elections is the PSNI now will give each candidate a single point of contact, so that when they're out campaigning, that they know there's a police officer that they can contact. I think at the councils there were one for each district council, and last July they had sort of 4 areas within Northern Ireland, so every candidate knew what to do. PSNI are much more active now in terms of providing briefings for candidates and for elected members in terms of stepping up their own security and what support the PSNI can give to them to keep them safe. I think we should also probably give credit to the Northern Ireland Assembly. The Commission there has now put forward funding for MLAs so that they can put security features in, be it at their personal address at the office, and that's something that we would like to see potentially rolled out across the UK. The problem is we have spent these years providing that guidance and that support, but I do think we need a cultural change within our society. As Vijay alludes, we've got a younger generation that are coming through that think that this is acceptable and a normal part of politics, and I think the threat in Northern Ireland and I suppose across the UK, particularly when we speak to female candidates, that people are going to stop putting themselves forward, and I think that would be hugely damaging to our democracy.
Add something to this.
Yes,
on election day itself, Mr. Robinson asked about fraud. The biggest concern that we had in the office was about intimidation of the polling station staff.
Right.
In part because people didn't bring ID with them and they had to be turned away, and there was harsh words and things like that. But in part because you sort of, they're, as Mr. Robinson has indicated, they're exposed in terms of they're running a polling station, and it is extremely difficult whenever people are doing it, essentially a public service, and to be abused in that way is just unacceptable.
That was a concern that you had in advance, and was that concern realised on the day?
No, yes, absolutely.
Can you give us some examples of the kind of thing that you're talking about?
So, people with didn't bring the ID or their ID with them and were turned away, and then they said things, and those sort of things. We had situations where people were concerned over their safety, and the police were, in terms of coming in and going from the polling station, the police were involved in helping and supporting that. So those are the sorts of things that we would be concerned about, and I don't know how you manage that. It involves a cultural change, as Cahir has said, but the challenge, that is definitely something that concerns me.
Thank you. And maybe bringing it back to then that level of kind of what might that broader cultural or governmental response be? Do you have any suggestions? I know that you've obviously written a report based on the most recent election. Do you have suggestions that the government might want to take up to try and address some of these things that clearly go beyond just the limited period of an election campaign, but which perhaps talk about the way that we consume or engage with politics more generally?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pennington. We've got a series of recommendations. I think at the moment we're feeding these into to the Speakers' Conference, because that will be a very helpful place to debate these. They fall into several categories. One is a series of more technical things. For example, I think we sometimes put candidates in the difficult position of choosing between proving how local they are and their own personal security by publishing their home address. Again, the Welsh government have made some interesting changes there, where they don't have to publish a home address. I think we want to look at that. Is it a good idea to have some candidates, particularly if they're independent, particularly if they're their own agent, having to publish their own personal home address? So it's quite technical things that would help. Around polling stations themselves, we think we ought to be giving returning officers the power with the police to say, well, actually, this should be the perimeter, and to define that. There's some difficult areas. But much more broadly, coming back to Cahir's point on kind of cultural change, we've sent some evidence and proposals into the Department for Education, and we will be talking to the Northern Ireland Department for Education as well, about the need to improve the citizenship teaching in schools. Now, this is clearly essential should votes at 16 happen, and we will need to build on the sort of work that we did in Wales and Scotland when that happened. But we think that a combination of showing young people in schools why it's important to participate in a democratic process, what that gets them, why is it important for them at all, and to be honest, humanising politicians and candidates to them, making them not appear as other and someone else a very long way away, would be really useful. It would also help with two of the linked challenges, partly this issue of abuse and intimidation, if they get to know why people stand to be candidates, that they are human, that it's a good thing to be a candidate, not something I think people often say. And someone standing, on their beliefs, saying, this is what I can do to help you, great. But it would also help, I think, with the digital literacy, mis and disinformation parts as well, to understand. So we've put in evidence, having brought together 40 civil society and other organisations across the UK, to say this is how we think it can be done across the UK, which will help some of these longer term trends. And then finally, we run very big public campaigns. We run them on registration, we run them on voter ID, we run them on vote security, like Your Voters Vote Alone. So we're thinking about how to build into our public campaigns more of an emphasis on this to cover all voters, not just those in schools.
Yeah, I really appreciate those broader reflections. It's something that I've experienced as well. Many of the things that you've described in terms of defacing of posters, but also kind of physical attacks, not in this election, but in previous. I've experienced directly. I'm just going to kind of very clearly flag up that I'm moving on to the next question now, which is about the experience of women in particular, because there is a gender dynamic that you've already alluded to here. And it's a shame that the member for Lagan Valley isn't here, because I know that this is something that she feels very particularly about, but she's unable to be here today. So about the experience of women participating in elections. I mean, you've talked about I don't know whether necessarily you're saying there's a higher level of abuse directed towards women, but that abuse takes on a very particular kind, very often involving sexualised imagery and things like that. Can you just give us an insight into the nature of that abuse? Does it take on a particular form in Northern Ireland? What are the PSNI doing to help you to keep these elections fair, open, honest, transparent? I'll leave that question there, and then I've got a potential follow-up as well.
I mean, some of the stuff's pretty grim, to be honest with you, and horrific. I've had female candidates and elected representatives, deep fakes, highly pornographic, hugely upsetting to the families. We have heard from candidates and elected representatives who've been stalked, who've had people, because obviously with the imprint on your election material, some candidates would use their home address or an office address, and they will have people maybe stand at the end of the driveway or outside their office. We know of female candidates who've been made intentionally to feel uncomfortable, again, when they're out canvassing, either be that hurling verbal abuse or just stalking and following. I go back to the point about the PSNI and how this links to their strategy for tackling violence against women and young girls. They've been much more proactive in working in partnership with us. We work very closely in terms of with the Assembly, looking at how we can go and speak to all members, but particularly the particular issues that arise with female candidates and elected representatives, to provide that support to them. So we're trying as much as we can, but I go back to that point, it is that cultural change that it is needed, and as Vijay saying, doing that education and so forth. I think ultimately it's going to be a long haul to do that, but it's just frankly unacceptable, and as I say, the real challenge is that female candidates are now having reservations about putting themselves forward for election, and they've told us that as well.
Vijay, do you want to come in on that?
Just one answer to your question. Yes, there's both a quantitative and a qualitative difference. We think, and this is coming from our direct surveys of candidates, that the women candidates reported twice as much serious abuse and harassment than the male candidates. It's very broadly, it's lumpy. It's very it's not uniformly distributed, but that's the sort of scale that you can. So when we ask people, is it serious? Twice as many women are saying it's serious than men. 3 times as many ethnic minorities as well. If you're a woman and an ethnic minority, you probably get even more than that. And if you're on the front bench, you get even more. So there's a clear scale in this, but we're definitely seeing a major gender divide, both qualitative and quantitative. In terms of the actual abuse suffered, I mean, things like inappropriate touching, kissing happened to women candidates, didn't really happen to many men. And online, it's a completely different experience, I think, as Cahir has already said.
And then in terms of something that Cahir finished on right at the end there, which was about this is having a direct impact on the willingness of women to participate in elections and put themselves forward as candidates. You alluded to that. What is the evidence of it? What are people saying to you? And ultimately, can we quantify who and how many we are missing out on because of the experience that they may have had or they hear about?
We're looking at that. I don't think I can give you very good data, which actually says here is who is not standing. We obviously have the experiences of say, ex-members of Parliament or of different assemblies who have said they're standing down. We have quite a few testimonies, and we've talked to a lot of candidates who say things like, I would stand, but I wouldn't put my family through this again. And it's that kind of phraseology just coming through that makes us concerned that what we could see is a significant reduction in people standing. Having said all that, we had a lot of people, we had a record number of candidates stand at this general election, so we're not yet seeing a real problem, we think, but it is a concern. What we are seeing, and we can put numbers on, is that when threatened, candidates are changing their own behaviour. So a very large number say they are changing how they interact with voters, and women are about twice as likely as men to say they won't canvass alone, they won't walk down the streets alone. And we've had plenty of evidence of that. So that is a real worry. Again, our system is a very low money system compared to many others around the world, but it's very much dependent, as you know better than I, at direct voter contact with candidates. And if that is off-putting to some candidates and they're changing and not talking to voters, but we've had some very clear testimony from quite a few women candidates that is what's going on.
I just add to that as well, and on the point about what candidates are now think is acceptable behaviour. I mean, there is now this attitude of, well, take it on the chin, if you're putting yourself forward, and that is having a real negative impact as well. One thing we've been encouraging candidates to do at recent elections is to report all of it to the PSNI. I think there's an attitude of, well, somebody put a tweet up, or they called me this out in the street. It needs reported, and we really are strongly encouraging, no matter how trivial it may seem, the only way we're going to change it is if the PSNI, it is reported to the PSNI, because if the PSNI have that data, then they can put more resource into tackling that, and that's something we've been certainly advocating for the last number of years.
Yeah, I think we probably better move on.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, Cahir, on that point where you said about things needing reporting, I think all elected representatives in post also should, report everything. I think it's good practice because there's a track and it's a record of everything, and then that allows you to be able to, and the police to be able to track it as well. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I think you said, Vijay, that there was double the number of negative experiences for females over males, and then there was other factors that then you said contributed further. Was that a UK average? Was that a Northern Ireland experience? Or is there a difference between Northern Ireland and other parts of the United Kingdom?
That's broadly a UK-wide experience, and I think a Northern Ireland one. And say we can't see a really major difference between the two. It's broadly a comparable set of experiences, yes. And that's across several different elections as well, where we're not just taking this general election.
I think from this committee's perspective, it's useful to know if there was a distinguishing feature or not. You've mentioned on a couple of occasions now the Speaker's Conference around the experience for candidates, and there has been some political consternation, maybe not as hard as that, concern that when it's being considered through the prism of the Speaker's Conference, it's almost as if it's for those who are already elected, and a concern that we're worried about ourselves, and that doesn't then translate to those who would be aspiring to be parliamentarians or assembly members or councillors. Have you any concerns that that process is very much seen to be an internal parliament discussion for existing members as opposed to those who wish to put their hat in the ring? Should it be organised by the Speaker's Conference, or should these discussions be had outside for all of those seeking to come here?
From our point of view, and we will be putting in quite a significant piece of evidence to the Speakers' Conference. This should be about candidates, and not just the candidates for Westminster, but also very much for the Senedd, for the Scottish Parliament, and for councillors as well, who actually are the ones who take a lot of the brunt of this. And just to pick up on your point earlier, it's also the abuse and intimidation suffered unacceptably by any electoral staff who are involved in the process. So it's about the culture, I think, of how we conduct. Obviously, we need extremely robust disagreement. Offence can be taken. People can say the strongest things. But there's such a big line between that and what we're actually talking about here, which is the sort of real abuse and intimidation, which people know is unacceptable, and no members of the public really support. So we would like to see this done really quite broadly, not least given the age figures I gave earlier. This is something which could become an even bigger problem as online media grows, and potentially as acceptability of this grows.
As it stands, you'll give evidence, but you have no concerns.
Exactly. Can I say the other part, which we are, so it's a concern, but you're saying there is an understandable wish to reduce the vulnerability of candidates and elected representatives. So put some shielding around them, get the police to give security advice. There is a concern on that, which is it's possible to move into a place where candidates and elected representatives therefore are distanced from voters and therefore can't interact with them in the way that they want to. So we would really want to focus, and we are focusing in terms of our recommendations, in terms of reducing the threat, not just reducing the vulnerability of candidates, trying to get people not to make these sorts of threats or behave in this way, rather than protect candidates when members of the public do. So we'll need to do a little bit of both.
Can I just repeat a point that Vijay made as well? I think education is very important in challenging this as well. And we have started to develop an increasing number of resources bespoke for Northern Ireland, but also in other parts of the UK, trying to change that culture so that our younger generations are coming through, as we alluded to earlier, about why you should participate in politics, what is a candidate there for, moving away from that kind of their fair game for abuse. So over the coming years, we're certainly looking to link much more closely with the Department of Education, the Minister, and with the Education Authority to try and embed this into the curriculum.
Yeah, thank you. And on the point about education, I think that's really important. I used to be a school teacher and feel very strongly that there is a lot more that we can do, across all the devolved nations and in the United Kingdom. But Vijay, you've spoken quite a lot about social media, The impact of social media on families, it's off-putting also for candidates to put themselves forward. It is something that's a real issue. You've spoken about having regular contact with social media platforms, with Ofcom and the police about candidate online abuse. But what do they need to do? What needs to change? You said they were reacting and working well with you, but if we're going to remove or limit abuse online, what actually needs to change?
If I may, that's a very big question to which we only have a very small part of the answer. We have to work very much with Ofcom, with many of the other regulators on this. Our answer so far has been, if we see illegal content, i.e. Incitements to violence, for example, that clearly needs to be referred very, very quickly to the police, to the social media firms, and taken down. There's a lot of political content, and obviously political free speech is not regulated, and we are not the regulator for that in this country. And that will happen and be more and be open to everyone. Where we have seen particular instances of abuse and intimidation has actually been in closed groups. So I think some of the candidates have been telling us it's come through in closed Facebook and WhatsApp groups, quite local. That's really very hard to track down, and clearly we're not present in those. But I think, just to echo your point, it's really important that elected representatives and others report material like that, because I don't think it's all reported at the moment. Then there's a broader issue on online of mis and disinformation, and so far the approach we have taken is as campaign material and free speech is not regulated by us, but where we see mis or disinformation about the electoral process, we will move in very quickly and very loudly. And we did see some examples of that, but with government and in our own systems, in the run-up to the general election, we stood up a process. So if we saw people saying, for example, you don't need to bring your voter ID, we would, on whatever social media channel that was, contradict that really loudly, link to the right material. We were also monitoring some of the AI answers to these, and were they actually giving misleading answers. And some of those were very responsive, actually. I think one in particular, when asked before the election what the outcome was of the UK general election, it gave a very definitive answer. And we asked them not to do that, and they then just linked to our pages. So actually some of them were very open. But this is clearly a matter of real concern now with the changes in social media regulation. But now we're working very much with Ofcom on implementation of the Online Safety Act. So I think that there's a lot more that we will need to do here.
And from your perspective, Cahir, is there anything from Northern Ireland that is specific to that you'd like to see change?
It is a UK-wide problem, as you alluded to. Yes, there are peculiarities to Northern Ireland, I suppose, given the legacy of home and the issues that have emerged in the past. But what's good for Gander to do, I think we will all have to work together. And this it's a UK-wide problem. It's a global problem, really.
Yeah, thank you, Chris Blow.
Yeah. Like it often happens, my question's kind of been answered by some of the earlier questions, but there is a supplementary, particularly focusing on the code of conduct, and I guess this is more focused for you, Sarah and David, about the code of conduct for campaigning in and around polling stations in general. And I just wanted to hear your feedback on whether the majority of the political parties had signed up to the code of conduct and whether they'd abided by it, and whether there was any potential room for improvements or updates and further changes, and just to get your perspective on how that worked out.
So the commission and ourselves work together on the code of conduct. I'll say a few words, but Cahir maybe say about the detail. We had a previous code around campaigning in the vicinity of polling stations. The code of conduct that we've just published in the last few days goes wider than that, covers wider issues. It's fair to say, and Sarah will comment on this in terms of the local elections in 23, that where we've identified issues and campaigning near polling stations where they were substantial, we were able to communicate with the senior officials in the relevant parties to address those as much as we possibly could. But I mean, I mentioned in the earlier answers that we feel that come back to our staff as well, that campaigning in the vicinity of polling stations, there needs to be a further look at how best to do that. I appreciate that's going to be difficult, but that's something. In terms of the Code of Conduct, Carol, can we come back into detail on that?
So the Code of Conduct, it was published last week, so it wasn't in place for the parliamentary election. We had consulted widely on it with all registered political parties in Northern Ireland, with the PSNI, the PPS, Information Commissioner's Office and so forth. We had to delay it because of the election, and then we started it again in autumn. Have all the parties supported it? Well, most of the parties give us feedback, and we've been very explicit with the parties that silence is consent. The test or the proof of the pudding's in the eating, I suppose, when we get to 2027. The code goes much wider than the previous code that David alluded to, and it's behaviours in the run-up to polling day. So looking at how you encourage people to register to vote, the handling of absent vote papers and applications and so forth, and then behaviours outside of polling stations. We've touched on the conversation earlier on about those behaviours outside polling stations. It's a mixed bag. I mean, you can go to some polling stations and there's not a centre about, and you go to some, and I can appreciate why it would be intimidating for voters. I think there is a balance to be struck between allowing campaigning to happen. It's a feature of our democracy. It's very important that candidates get that opportunity to get their message out there, but it shouldn't be at the expense that electors feel uncomfortable going to a polling station. What the code tries to do, we use the word must and should throughout quite a lot. Must is legal, and that has to happen. If there was any breach of that, then that would be a matter for the PSNI. Where we say should, and I suppose to give the example of improper behaviour outside of a polling station, then we would like whoever's witnesses that to either contact ourselves or the Chief Electoral Officer, and we will directly contact a point of contact within each of the political parties and basically ask them to sort it out. It does happen, and it has happened in the past, where unintentionally, I've seen examples of canvassers stopping cars from going into the car park just to hand them a leaflet, and that looked quite intimidating because it kind of is a security guard or a bouncer, and you see huddles of people maybe standing by a narrow entrance into the gate. Again, I'm not suggesting that they're intentionally trying to be intimidating, but I can see for voters why that would be the case. In terms of the electorate, the public view, they're largely ambivalent towards it. We have done survey work and asked about that, and most voters would say yes, seeing somebody outside a polling station, but their mind's already made up before they've gone to the polling station. So I suppose there is a question there about what value they do add, but by law they're entitled to be there. As in other parts of the world, there is an exclusion zone, if you like, and we don't have that, and that's why the code is being drafted.
Just to follow up on that, I guess for politicians and political parties, it's a turnout operation, right? Trying to work out who hasn't been to the polls as such. But would you favour, having experienced some election protocols in the United States, some of those states have much wider exclusion zones for campaigning and around their polling stations. Do you think even the appearance of intimidation of people being near the polling station might have an impact on people's turnout, or I know it's anecdotal, but
hard to quantify. I observed in the Irish general election at the end of November with Sarah. Actually, we went down to Dublin, and some colleagues went to Donegal, and it was a very different atmosphere. There was nobody outside of the polling station at all, and it seemed quite, it was a normal polling station. It's difficult to quantify. We have, as I say, voters generally are indifferent towards it, is what they're telling us. But it's very, very difficult to know if somebody has made a conscious decision not to go to the polling station because of concerns outside, or who may or may not be outside of a polling station. The law allows it to happen at the minute, so we're working around that framework.
Do you want to add anything, Sarah?
I think the only thing I would add is, whilst the code of conduct is excellent and it's a really good starting point for us, I think the most important thing with 500-600 polling station managers who are responsible for those polling stations on one day, every year, every few years, trying to manage a very complex process. What they need more than anything is clarity, because without that clarity, where they're having difficult conversations, potentially difficult conversations with candidates and people who they see as kind of public figures, that clarity is going to be the single most important thing for them to have those conversations.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Katrina Murray.
You mentioned earlier about the subject of co-option. Now, coming from Scotland, which operates STV elections for local authorities and is in a perpetual round of local council by-elections, which completely skew the picture that was there to begin with, you can understand that one of the things that is being talked about is wouldn't the Northern Ireland system of co-option be quite good, particularly by political activists who are sick of continually being on the doors in a round of by-elections. So, given that there's been concerns expressed about the system of co-options or the co-option process, could you give us a bit more detail about those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, David and I were in Glasgow last March for a by-election. I did think, I mean, we'll not get into e-counting and the merits of that in Northern Ireland, but I did think this is a bit mad, for an STV election that you're having a by-election. And just to be clear, we wouldn't be advocating a return to by-elections in Northern Ireland. I just don't think they work under the single transferable vote system. They do happen elsewhere in the Irish Republic. Vacancies are filled by by-elections, but we have this process in Northern Ireland called co-options. It's been in place for, I'm going to say around 15 years, but don't quote me exactly on that, and we are seeing in increasing use of it. Co-option has a place. I suppose our concern is that it lacks transparency and potentially is damaging to voter choice. All parties use it as is their right to do so, but I think why this became an issue last July was that if 5 MPs were elected, created 4 vacancies in the Assembly and a vacancy in Council. Those 4 vacancies in the Assembly were filled by 4 councillors, therefore creating a further 4 vacancies in Council. I think our concern is looking ahead to 2027 that this could be potentially damaging the voter confidence in the integrity of the poll, where you could see a situation where a candidate stands for local government with a running mate who's also standing in the Assembly. They get elected into both institutions and then stand down in one, and then somebody that doesn't get elected ends up in a local council. So it's not that we're advocating that the system needs to go, but we need to find ways that can make it more transparent. One of the suggestions we made, which is sort of stealing a wee bit from Scotland as well, is a kind of substitutes list, using the list system, that when at the time of their nominations that candidates would provide a name, or maybe not even the party could provide a name of lists to cover all of the the constituencies that their candidates are standing in, just so that's available and voters can see, in the event that if the person is deceased or if they stand down from office, that there is some transparency as who will fill that vacancy, just as we're seeing an increasing use of it. I think continuing as we are in that pattern just could be very damaging to confidence in the electoral process.
You want to add anything on?
No, that's exactly the issue I think we're seeing. It's looking ahead. This could be significantly worse, and particularly when there's a confluence of elections in 2027 where the knock-on effects are quite hard to work out what could happen.
Taking on from that, particularly if you're looking at the substitution list, or that if you, as you outlined in the Scottish Parliament, well, that's a completely different DeHunt system where people are expressing a preference for the party, not necessarily an individual candidate. In STV, people make that choice as to an absolute individual candidate. So within that, if somebody has stood and has been part of that list, then voters have arguably made a very distinct choice that they do not want the person that might be next on the list. My understanding was that was the system that was in place until about 2009. It'd been, you said 15 years, so that's about that's 2009. Why should we return to it?
The problem we have at the minute is, your point's right. Electors vote for somebody and they expect that person to be in office. That the co-option system takes that decision from the voter and puts it in the hands of the nominating officer of the political party, of the candidate at the time that they were elected. So if they've changed party or they've become independent, it doesn't matter because it's it rests with the presiding officer. I think the reason that we've highlighted in this report is there is no perfect answer. We get that, and we see that in Scotland, because it is a challenge in terms of, you know, how do you move away from this process of by-elections. And I have no doubt the substitutes list may very well throw up a lot of other unintended consequences, but I think that the key issue is the lack of transparency around, and we need to find a system, certainly ahead of 2027, that is just more transparent in the decision-making process of the co-options.
I recognise no system is perfect. Nothing will have that level of. There is nothing that has that level of perfection there. Is there anything? But one of the things we're also concerned about is actually how do we make sure that we increase participation and not just democratic accountability, but participation in the process as well. Has there been other approaches considered with that?
The participation in the wider electoral process and democracy, I mean, it goes back to what we were sort of talking about earlier on about the voter education. That's certainly, and Vijay may want to touch on this in terms of our sort of corporate plan over the next 5 years, that's a key aspect of work for us going forward, particularly in Northern Ireland from my perspective, but across the UK, that it is that getting that younger generation and giving them that information. I think historically our focus has been giving people the tools, the information about being registered to vote and how to participate in the election and vote. I think it's much wider than that. Vijay, do you want to pick up on that?
Just to build a little, so under the legislation we are required to produce a 5-year corporate plan which will come to the Speaker's Committee for the Electoral Commission in time for this financial year, and as Cahir says, one of those elements is going to be, a big part is going to be on education, a big part is going to be on voter information and trying to ensure that people actually have access to everything from the list of candidates to where a polling station is and is it accessible and can I actually get in this particular way, all of which I think can be significantly improved. We're also thinking hard about the broader kind of campaigns and media work that we do. It's clearly got to be value for money. Some of it on registration may need to change its focus a bit depending on the registration system. Some of it on voter ID. We spent a lot of money on voter ID before this election, not something this committee may be that interested in because obviously it works very well in Northern Ireland, but we were taking the learning from Northern Ireland and we were concerned about making sure that awareness of voter ID was as uniform as it could be across the UK, having very different levels, I think would have generated real concern about turnout in different areas. Actually, we got to around the 90% mark in all areas of the UK, in Wales, in Scotland, which obviously hadn't had a voter ID, whereas it's been for 20 years in Northern Ireland. So that was good. There was a degree of uniformity. But again, we're trying to look ahead at what is the right set of policies and changes that we need to do across all the elections in the UK.
Can I go back? Do you want to add anything in on that one?
I was just going to say, I think as a broader point, there's an element here about accessibility and kind of elector expectation as well. So we live in a day where you can put an Amazon order in and get stuff delivered that day. Whereas actually, if we think about registering to vote, you're going to do an application. We're going to have a 5-day clear objection period for people to object to that. We're then going to put you on at the next prescribed in-time notice of alteration, at which point you can apply for a postal vote by paper in Northern Ireland, and we will then put that into a run. Like, it's not the way the law is structured as a whole hasn't kept up with kind of public expectation on doing something and getting that kind of instant reaction.
Now go back to you, Sarah and David. How have you found the administration of the co-option process?
I mean, it's a process. It's well defined in law. We have administered it over the last number of years. We don't have a particular position to take on the process, apart from the fact that it's clear, black and white. It's clear what we do. The nominating officers are prescribed in law. We deal direct with them, and by and large, it works for us. That said, I mean, we hear what the Commission are saying, but it'll be up to government to determine whether to amend the law or not.
Okay. Thank you, Gavin.
Thanks, Chair. Probably should just declare I'm a nominating officer of a party, and I think I was the last person to have been co-opted when there could have been a by-election to Belfast City Council in March 2010. And then the next month, 6 more came in, including Claire Hanna on this committee, because co-options were then in place where there was no by-election. And there was 2 reasons for that. One was the one I'm going to come on to. The other reason was the ending of double jobbing. And there was so many transitioning from having 2 positions to 1 that scores of by-elections across Northern Ireland wouldn't have been appropriate. But the other issue, Cahir, I just wanted to raise with you was around the durability of a list. I was on a list in East Belfast for Lord Brown when he was an Assembly member. But you put down 5 names, and over a 5-year term, those 5 people have change in circumstances, change in political interest, change in life, may not live in the same constituency, have no desire to stand. So if there is an aspiration to have more transparency around a list system, what flexibility would there be in that to account for the changes in life circumstances for anybody named on that list? Because that was the secondary issue that meant that the system had to change.
Yep, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I think the reason that we flagged this in the report was it's just that lack of transparency. I recognise that is a particular risk with the subject. Things evolve very, very quickly. As you say, people might change party allegiance and so forth. But as it stands, and as you know, it rests with the nominating officer, and that's it. And the public have no sight of that or awareness of it. So there may well be an education aspect to it about what the co-option process is there, why we do it, and why we don't have by-elections. But it is starting that conversation, Gavin, I think is what we want to do by putting that in the report. There is no perfect solution, but I think what we have at the minute, particularly when we look ahead to 2027, it concerns me about the impact that will have on the integrity of the polls if we're seeing a lot of movement after an election has just happened.
Okay, thank you. Vijay, with your kind of oversight, the Labour Party's election manifesto promised to extend the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in all elections. Is it your understanding that this will include Northern Ireland?
That's our understanding at the moment, yes. I mean, clearly this depends both on the government bringing forward a bill and then Parliament working through it, but we at the moment are advising and looking at the implications of that and what we would need to do. And I think a big part of that would be, first of all, voter education, and second, the public campaigns around this. The third is going to be what kind of voter ID would be used. So we're trying to work through each of the implications of that in order to be able to advise both government and Parliament when the legislation comes.
Okay, and I was just wondering, Kay, what considerations need to be taken into account, in extending this franchise into Northern Ireland?
Can I say?
Yeah, go on.
The next set of elections in Northern Ireland is not due until 2027. One thing for sure, Chair, is that if the law is to be amended, we need plenty of time to be able to implement the changes locally in terms of the registration process, in terms of we won't just be people registering age 16. There will be people registering to vote age 14 and 15 on the assumption that the law follows broadly what happens in Scotland and Wales. Therein lies a challenge, because at the minute we use national insurance numbers as a framework to if you like, verify people's identity. When children are aged 14 or 15, they won't have a national insurance number to help that process. So we need to find a way to if you like, address that specific issue in Northern Ireland. And then voter ID in Northern Ireland, Chair, it runs obviously through passports, driving licence. Anybody less than 17 won't have a driving licence, so there's a challenge there around the electoral identity card in Northern Ireland, which essentially we produce. It's not like the voter authority certificate in Great Britain. The electoral identity card in Northern Ireland is de facto a public sector card for people to use to get services. And again, if you have children aged 14, 15, there's a whole issue of safeguarding issues that we would need to look through as well. So what we would strive for, if this bill is brought forward, that it's brought forward as promptly as possible to give us time to implement that for the 27 elections.
I mean, David, what you've just explained is a lot of work. and perhaps a lot of money. Have you measured that? Have you got any kind of scope to see what you're going to need?
Not to the level of a right down to the absolute pound, shillings and pence, but I mean clearly there will be changes. There'll be changes in procedures of polling stations, for example, in terms of maybe changes in how people if you like, understand how to deal with younger folk when they come into the polling station. There's a whole raft of challenges it will create. I appreciate it's happened in Scotland and Wales, and clearly we can learn from that. But yes, it's not without its challenge, and it will take time and effort.
And the other question I've got there, you said about identifying young people in time for them to be able to vote and be registered. How does that happen if there's no national insurance? How does that happen in Wales and Scotland? So I should know the answer.
I know the Scottish.
Do you want me to come in on
yes,
that
go on, Sarah.
So where they're registering at 14-15, the councils and VJBs in Scotland are using other council records. So they're using things like education records. So in Wales, they're held within the county council anyway, and there's data sharing agreements that can be put in place and use that instead. Obviously in Northern Ireland we've got the challenges that we need to get the data sets across the whole of Northern Ireland, and there isn't always a one-on-one relationship. And I think the other key challenge, just to pull out on Northern Ireland, that is different to Scotland and Wales, is in Scotland and Wales the national insurance number is only used at the point of the person applying.
Yeah.
And then once they've applied, it's removed. Whereas in Northern Ireland, they have the legal provision to retain the national insurance number, and we actually hold that on a person's record and use that as part of a personal identifier where we've got a much bigger data set, and the linking it with the digital registration number as well. So for 14-15-year-olds in Northern Ireland, they will need to register not using a national insurance number because they won't have one. We'll need to get the national data, but we will then also need to back supplement the national insurance numbers once they're already registered and they get one.
Is it just a bit off beam now, this question, but so there's an issue around data. So what needs to be done around data gathering in Northern Ireland in order to improve that situation then with local authorities in general?
We have been looking at this in terms of the data that might be required. We currently use the health service register. There's a health service register that essentially covers anybody registered with a family doctor, dentist, optician, and that also has included in it when the last time the activity, the last prescription, there's a time which gives a sense of currency. That would be available for people aged 14-15. We currently have access to that for anybody over 16, but we don't have it for access to for anybody aged 14 and 15. So it would be a matter of extending that register as just one way, but that wouldn't include the national insurance number. So we would also then have to find a way, if you like, to repopulate national insurance numbers as and when those 14-15-year-olds turn 16. So there is a challenge here, there's no doubt, and it's not straightforward.
And I think just to add on that, and I'm sure you would have the learning from Scotland and Wales as well, is people get really jumpy about 14-15-year-olds data as opposed to people who are over 16. So in making the law, I guess in the UK Parliament, there's just a plea about making it as explicitly clear so that people don't come up against those kind of data protection hurdles on it.
Chair, can I just add?
Yes,
you're absolutely right. This issue about, first of all, what data sources are used to assist or to actually put people onto the register is crucial. Then the second question is what is then held on the register and then of use to the returning officers or registration officers or to voters after that. There are pilots about to start in Wales in 4 local authorities looking at assisted and automated registration using the local council data, and clearly what the discussions that we're having with central government in Westminster are about the use of some of the data sets, the UK-wide data sets. There are ways on both of these, and clearly there are extremely good international comparators about ways to push up both the completeness and the accuracy simultaneously of the register. And our register is good, but it's by no means as good as it could be. And we think there are millions of people who are eligible, estimates between 5 and 8 million people in the UK who should be on the register. And so there is a big opportunity to try to improve the completeness and the accuracy of the register at the moment and make it much more usable for everyone who uses it, including political parties.
I do think Northern Ireland's probably a little bit ahead of the game here in terms of the data sets that are available. Obviously the structure of electoral administration is different in Northern Ireland in that you have a centralised electoral register managed by David and Sarah. But the data is rich, and going back to the earlier discussion about Canvas, when the last Canvas took place in 2021, and Sarah will correct me if I'm wrong, we took that data and matched it against the register. Obviously everybody came off, but about 85% of the population, the data showed they were still there. So you were spending millions of pounds taking people off an electoral register, and this will happen in 2030 without a legislative change. Millions of pounds to take people off and put them back on again when we know roughly 85% is right, Sarah, is it? Roughly about 85% of people, the data shows that they're there. And David and I have had discussion as well. The data that's available to David, he can pinpoint down to a house and know who's in there and know that person's eligible to vote. The data shows it. Because that individual hasn't taken the time to fill in a form or gone online to do that, they're missing from the register.
So, as an example, Chair, today we write to householders in houses where we know there's a 16 and 17-year-old who's there but not on the register. We don't write to the 16 and 17-year-old because that would be disclosing a person's name, but we write to the householder to say it is our understanding that there's a young person registered or living in this house, and we do that every year. So that's the sort of thing that we think we could do. We could have some sort of a targeted initiative.
Yeah, that's good. I just want to turn to turnout. So the UK turnout in general elections has seen a steady decline over the past 25 years. Is that true in Northern Ireland, Vijay? Or Cahir?
Yeah. Steady decline. Certainly, I've been with the Commission for quite some time, and it was in the high 60s, 70s, and now it's slipping to the sort of mid 50s, low 60s.
And are you seeing the difference, the turnout at Westminster elections compared to Assembly elections as well? Are you seeing what trends are you seeing there?
Roughly the same. Where we always saw lower turnout at European parliamentary elections when they happened, and that wasn't a unique Northern Ireland problem. And we would have thought local government election turnout would have been lower, but it wasn't in 2023. I think it was fairly consistent. It is around that 55 to 60 mark, and that's been quite consistent over the last number of years.
So what's your assessment then of, and this has been spoken about, the public level of trust in elections in Northern Ireland?
Well, the election report we found that still exists, thankfully. They are high levels. In recent elections, it's been in the mid to high 80s. People do trust the process and see that it works. I suppose, despite a lot of our criticism about it being a bit antiquated, the fact that it is a paper-based system, it is safe in some ways. If it was more digitalised, then maybe it might be more prone to cyber attack and so forth. But people, by and large, do trust the system, and their experience of their interaction with the electoral office, be that through the electoral registration process or at the polling station, is generally a positive one, which is good given some of the issues that we've talked about today and the challenges that poses to democracy.
Okay, thanks. And I'm just going to Al Pinkerton then.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask a question about something that has been touched upon multiple times before, and that's the digital registration numbers. Can you just give us a sense of what changes were introduced in that process for this most recent general election? Do you consider these to be in any way a barrier to participation in elections? It sounds not, because there's some very clever mechanisms, I think. Well, or maybe, I don't want to preempt it, but you did talk about the possibility of this am I registered to vote lookup, which sounds that that's directly related to the digital registration, which does allow people to check whether they're on the roll. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, okay.
I don't want to preempt any of the questions, but then I do also have a follow-up probably after.
For those that Northern Ireland has a specific difference to the rest of the United Kingdom around digital registration number. When you go to register to vote online, the elector, when they become registered, gets given a number, digital registration number, that's essentially on the piece of paper that tells them that they've been registered to vote. When you then go to apply for an absent vote, be that a postal vote or a proxy vote, you have to provide that number to verify. And the rationale that the Northern Ireland Office brought forward was that there was a wet signature that once you were registered online, you removed that safeguard. So what we found was that was fine for a period, but the canvass brought forward that a lot more people then registered online because it was easier to do. It was in the middle of the pandemic. So what we found then in the 2022 elections and the 2023 elections, a lot of people didn't realise they had a digital registration number. Okay, so they were applying for an absent vote but didn't know they had a digital registration number.
Sorry, just to go back, because they'd done this sometime in the past.
Exactly.
They hadn't kept a note of the number, and
exactly.
let's face it, who does?
Yeah. Digital registration number was introduced in 2017 when online registration was introduced in Northern Ireland. As David alluded to, the problem was you were still working on a register from the 2013 canvass. Right. So I think there's maybe 12,500, I have a feeling, people would have had a digital registration number at that time. When the canvass happened, all of a sudden over 1 million people had, or nearly 1 million people then all of a sudden got a DRN.
So essentially what we found, and it became a major concern, or at least an issue, it got media coverage in the 2023 local elections in Northern Ireland, when quite a number of people applied for an absent vote, but weren't successful because they didn't provide their digital registration number. So from that point, we identified a number of actions, but the primary one was this online Am I Registered tool. Now, you don't do things for one reason, you do it for two reasons. So the tool allows people to identify if they provide information about themselves, their date of birth, part of their national insurance number, their address, their full name. It allows to identify whether they're registered to vote at that address, but it also critically, and it's quite speedy because it's done through text messaging, it gives them their digital registration number as part of that confirmation. 50,000 people used that service at the 2024, during the short period of the 2024 general election. I would commend the service to the United Kingdom as a whole, because to the point that Vijay made about duplicate registrations, we think that would be useful. There is an Am I Registered service in most parts of the world. All the American states have it, Canadians have it, the Irish Republic has it. So this isn't my idea. This was so we've essentially just lifted and shifted the idea from there, and it's helped us. Now there is still a challenge, okay, because some people don't need their digital registration number because they applied to vote on paper, and some people applied to vote online. So what we're saying is we think the issue here is essentially some people need it and some people don't. Either make it for everybody so that the messaging is simple, or else remove it. That would be our sense, and we're asking government, or I've been on the record and saying this needs to be reformed. Yeah. There's a paper on our website that says that. I'm not necessarily saying get rid of it. I'm saying either keep it for everybody or remove it.
And so that would be the change that you would be asking, or at least the clarification that you're...
Exactly. We already have digital registration numbers for everybody on the register. We just don't give them out to the people who don't need them. And we'd like to change that so that it would be available, would be used for everybody, or remove it entirely.
I think from the Commission's...
I suppose that answers the question. What does this digital registration offer? I mean, what benefit does it bring? Why would you want to keep it if it acts as an impediment? Because presumably there was a sound justification for its introduction.
So the justification is back to the wet signature that we had back in in historical times, whenever it was all paper registration, and this was essentially an additional safeguard. Going forward, there is actually the genesis of if we move to automatic registration, or people who maybe don't have a national insurance number, there is actually a scenario where actually, now that we have it, it might be a sensible thing to keep it, but to make it ubiquitous, make it for everybody.
From the Commission's perspective, I mean, when it was introduced in 2017, we did flag concerns with it in terms of what is its actual purposes. As David alluded to, the government's told us that it was a security feature to replace the wet signature. Our concern was what would public awareness be, and particularly after the canvass in 2021. That's exactly what happened, as David alluded to, in 22 and 23. When you were applying for your DR, I mean, David has, to a large extent, fixed the problem with the online checking system. But at the 22 and 23 elections, when you applied you apply for an absent vote, you realise I need a digital registration number, and you're going, what is a digital registration number? You had to provide all this information to get the digital registration number, your name, your national insurance number, address, date of birth, and so forth. That's exactly the same stuff that you're putting on the absent vote application. So you're providing the same information twice, and we have never comprehended, and I've asked government, what is the clarification? You know, what extra level of security is the digital registration number bringing? We still haven't got a satisfactory answer to that. But as David has alluded to, this new system, people are getting it within seconds. You know, they get the digital registration number, and as we saw at the 24 elections, the number of applications rejected for not having a digital registration number fell dramatically. Now, it did highlight then there are other issues with the form in terms of, you know, people's understanding of how to complete that correctly. So I think there still is a question to be had about what is the purpose of the digital registration number, and as David alludes to, maybe it evolves into something else as another safeguard, but I think to take it as to what its purpose was in 2017, I'm not sure it's doing what it's meant to. I'm not even really clear what it's meant to do, if I'm being honest.
I suppose at least if once you do this lookup, then you get a text message. I suppose that at least provides you with an electronic record for future elections.
Exactly
what it is. So hopefully, if people remember, and if people are as bad at deleting their text messages as I am, it'll remain there on their phone. Can I just ask, does this in any way dovetail with the government's proposal for digital IDs?
If I may, exactly. It doesn't actually dovetail, but we have to make these systems actually, at the very least, interoperate. Maybe it's the same system, but that is very much the work that we're doing now. And I mean, in all of our work, we're trying to make sure we're taking full account of the differences in every region, in Northern Ireland in particular, which is why the work that Cahir and his team do is so crucial. And actually, while I'm here, I pay tribute to Dr. Katie Radford, who's just behind me, who's our Commissioner for Northern Ireland and lives there, and again make sure that at the Commission board we have a real understanding of what is happening in Northern Ireland, making sure we take full account of that. But clearly it's part of a broader UK system, and so I think particularly the paper which the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology brought out last week on digital identification and online verification is going to be absolutely crucial. So that coupled with whatever is happening on automatic or assisted registration will be an essential part of the context for where this goes. But I think our plea would be, can we have a single system which actually gets the best and learning from all of these, rather than multiple different systems where there's no need for difference like that, and where people moving across the UK, and which is definitely one of the issues that people fall off the register, people who move frequently, the more we have an integrated system, I think the better.
There we are. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. And I look forward to the Speakers' Conference and seeing the outcomes of that as well. So I'd like to thank our witnesses today and say order, order. Thanks very much.
Thank you.